Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to I&E's CCI Data Center Advanced Technology Series. In today's sessions for Unified Computing System, we're going to talk about administration of the system. Specifically, we're going to talk about the firmware management. So how does the catalog work differently for the infrastructure firmware versus the server hardware in terms of the blades, the rack mounts, and then all of the individual part details like the adapters, storage controllers, etc. We'll also look at backup and restore options. So how do we do the full state backup versus the configuration backups, and then how do we restore that either from the GUI and then from the CLI when we're starting a completely new upgrade. We'll also talk about the role-based access control and the org structure, how the locales work, how the users work, and then how we can do multi-tenancy from an administration point of view. Basically allow users to come in and to administer their individual blades, but then not affect other organizations or other users in the overall system. And then going along with that, we'll also talk about in-band management. So if we're doing infrastructure as a service and we're basically leasing out a blade to an end customer, we want them to be able to manage the OS on the server, but we don't necessarily want them to have infrastructure access to the rest of the devices like our Nexus 5K, 7K out-of-band management segment. So within the scope of the UCS, we'll see that we can do in-band management in terms of our regular, what would normally be like routed traffic going to the end hosts. But in order to support this, we have to talk about the disjoint layer 2 design in terms of the LAN connectivity. In our next section for the Unified Computing System, we're going to talk about the firmware versions and what are the different ways that we can upgrade and downgrade the system. How does the infrastructure firmware work different from the server firmware in terms of the blades, the rack mounts, and then all of the individual components like the adapters, network adapters, storage adapters, SIMC, etc. And we'll also talk about what are the different types of firmware, and then what are some of the issues that go along with the version compatibility in terms of the hardware versus the software versions. So in general, we'll see that the firmware of the entire system, so whether we're talking about the infrastructure components, which would be like the fabric interconnects, the I/O modules, the physical chassis, and then the actual server components, the B-series blades, the C-series rack mounts. One of the big advantages of the system overall is that we can manage all the firmware essentially from one central interface from the UCS manager. So in most traditional server designs, when we have just regular rack mount servers that are standalone, every time you want to upgrade the BIOS or every time you want to upgrade the drivers for an individual adapter, like your Windows drivers, Linux drivers, etc., you'd have to go to those servers individually or have some sort of external software management package in order to deal with the upgrades and downgrades. Where in the case of UCS, this is built into the main administration of the system. So specifically, this is going to be under the Equipment tab and then under Firmware Management. And we'll see that the process here is going to be very, very straightforward. There is an auto install that you can basically just upgrade or you can just upload the firmware packages to the system and then let it go through the entire upgrade process. Now, of course, some of these upgrades will be disruptive if we're changing like the BIOS version of the blade or of the rack mount. We would have to reboot or basically re-acknowledge the server in order to get those changes to make or to apply. But we can do the upgrade during a maintenance window, so we can basically install the firmware in advance and then schedule the reboot to say next time that I install, let's say like a Windows Service Pack or like a VMware update, then I have to reboot the server, that I also want to make those firmware changes from the UCS management point of view. And specifically what that would be controlled by is the maintenance policy under the service profile. So as we talked about the different types of policies before, server policies, the maintenance policy controls that if I make a change to the server that requires re-acknowledgement, let's say like adding a new virtual NIC or a new VHBA, that the default behavior is that the system doesn't ask you if you want to apply this change, it just immediately reboots the server and then starts to make those hardware changes. Where if we set the maintenance policy to user acknowledgement, we can schedule the reboot And we can schedule the changes here specifically for the firmware management, that if it is going to be a disruptive upgrade, we can say, next maintenance window, like Saturday 2 a.m., I want to reboot the blade and then install those changes. Okay, so first off, let's take a look at this from the GUI, specifically where we're going to be dealing with the firmware management. And then we'll take a look at the difference here between version 2.2 and 3.1 that we have running on our different chassis. Okay, so let's go over to our junk box. And on the junk box, I have two different UCS domains. One is running version 3.1, which we can see here from the HTML interface. It's running HTML5 instead of Java. And then we have the older release that is release 2.2 that's running on the Java interface. So from the front end point of view, the system is pretty much the same in terms of the features and functionality for the most part between the Java interface and the newer web interface. The main difference is going to be between the versions, though, is what's the hardware support. So for the new Fabric interconnects, which are the 6300s, the 40 gig models, not modules, the 40 gig models, those require 3.1 or later. And then one of the other problems that we run into is that some of the older hardware of the physical servers and the physical parts like the adapters, those are deprecated and those are no longer supported in the new versions. So we'll see here that we would have to go through two different upgrade paths depending on what the underlying hardware of the system is, based on the server generation. So if they're M1, M2, M3, M4 in terms of generation 1, 2, 3, 4, and then likewise the physical components like the VIC adapter, the legacy adapter. So we'll see that not all versions are compatible from a hardware-software matrix point of view. It basically works the way as like Nexus 7K. That as of version 7.x, they drop support for like the M1 modules, F1 modules, the older hardware. Same is going to be true with the UCS. But as one of the other advantages of the system is that we'll see that there's different firmware versions for the infrastructure versus the servers. Okay, in general, we call these bundles A, B, and C. So the infrastructure bundle is going to be the network type components of the system. So it's going to be the Fabric interconnects, the I/O modules or the Fabric extenders that we're wiring physically from the FI down to the blade chassis, and then some of the other components of the blade chassis like the chassis management controller, the CMC, the Cisco integrated management controller, the SIMC, which is like the KVM interface of the servers. That's going to be controlled by the infrastructure bundle, where the B bundles and C bundles are for the B series blades and the C series rack mounts respectively. These are going to be the packages that have the individual drivers, the hardware drivers for like the VIC adapters, the RAID controllers, the Flex Flash adapters and stuff like that. So the key point being is that you can upgrade the two of them separately, but like I mentioned, not all variations are going to be supported at the same time. So there is a possibility to upgrade the Fabric interconnects and the UCS manager, which is going to be part of the infrastructure bundle, while not upgrading the blade servers or the rack mount servers, but not all combinations are supported. So in my particular case, one of the chassis has older M2 blades and older adapters, which are the Generation 1 Cisco modules, I believe is an M81 KRs, and those are not supported in 3.x. So you basically can run into a case where your Fabric interconnects and the UCS manager would support upgrading. You install the firmware, the system does the upgrade, it reboots, and then when it goes to acknowledge the chassis, it could potentially have problems when it's trying to bring the individual servers up if the hardware is not supported. So for this, there's not really a lot of technology understanding that goes along with this. It's just a hardware-software matrix issue. So what I would recommend to do is, if you're doing this in a live production environment or even like in your lab environment, you need to check the release notes for the specific version, and then that tells you what is or is not the supported hardware details. So in this case, we have the release notes for UCS Manager 3.1, which is the current version as of May of 2017. And you can see like what are the new hardware details in the individual sub-releases. Like for example, 313A now supports these specific RAID controllers, these host bus adapters in terms of the like storage adapters, different GPUs. But also there's a section here that says what is not supported. So this would be the deprecated hardware and the third-party adapter support in the UCS manager. Which I believe is one of these is the specific part number that we have, which basically means that you're not able to run that hardware. Okay, so there's certain blades and there's certain adapters on the blades. You can see that are not supported in the version. But the potential issue here being is that the system doesn't tell you that when you go to upgrade. It'll allow you to upgrade the firmware package, and then when it comes back, we'll see the end result is that it's not going to be able to use some of the server. So you do have to be very careful with this in production. Make sure that you check all the details of, well, not necessarily all the details. It's mainly going to be just the blade generation. So like, is it B200 M3 or M4? And then the adapter part. So if they're the newer VIC adapters, VIC 1240, 1280, 1380, then those are going to be supported in the 3.1s. But not the older legacy adapters like the Emulex QLogic cards. So what we're going to do in this case is that we're going to go through the upgrade process, and then we'll look at specifically what happens when the system goes through the auto install and then it runs into a problem where the hardware is not supported. We'll see what that looks like from kind of a fault point of view. Okay, additionally, we'll see that the system for most of the components, with the exception of the fabric interconnects, it supports holding two different versions of the firmware. So you can think of this like the flash that's on the actual hardware piece, okay? Like it's storage for the firmware, but there's enough space for two different versions. There's an active and there's a backup version. So the basic idea is that if you're upgrading the firmware, your active version is going to be your older version. Your backup version is going to be the new one that you're downloading to it. And then when you go to reboot whatever the part is, like the SIMC, the IO module, or the actual blade or rack mount if you're upgrading the BIOS, what you would choose is the startup version is going to become the new version. And then the idea being is that if there's some sort of issue with the software and the upgrade did not work, then it's going to fall back to the backup version. Okay, so like in our particular case, we're going to be going from, on one chassis, we're going to go to from 3.1 in an older sub-release to 3.1, whatever the newest general deployment sub-release is. And then likewise, on the second chassis, we're going to go from 2.2 to 3.1, which is a major upgrade in terms of the hardware support. And then we'll see, when the blades run into an issue, because they're not supported in the newer software, we'll see that how we can basically recover that based on the fact that it's going to have multiple firmware versions already installed. Okay, now in the case of the fabric interconnect or the UCS manager itself, there's only one active version of firmware, but we don't necessarily care about that because the additional versions can just be stored on flash. So we'll see that with the end result in our case is that on one chassis we'll have 2.2 and 3.1 both installed on flash. And then if we need to move between the versions, we just click the drop down and say, hey, I want to reboot in 2.2. It is a time-consuming process because it has to upgrade, or excuse me, downgrade, like the fabric extenders, which are the IO modules, the individual pieces. But the system is going to go through this automatically. We don't have to go to each individual part and then specify that we want to manually upgrade the firmware. Now, we can do that. As we talked about part of the service profiles, there is a firmware package detail of the individual profile that we can define. So we can say that, let's say we have VMware ESX 5.5, so like an older version, and if there's some sort of hardware issue where I need to be running a specific driver version, like for my storage adapter, in order to be on the hardware compatibility list, you can choose that individually. So I can say I want to run like 2.21e for this particular part, and then I want to run 2.21f, whatever the sub-release naming convention is, on a different particular part. So you can get very, very granular but at the same time, you don't necessarily have to if you want to. So you can just let the system do auto install of everything, or you can selectively choose each and every individual part of the catalog. What do you want to upgrade? Okay, so let's take a look at the auto install. So the first thing that we need to do is to get the firmware version, the actual file, from our file system onto the Fabric interconnect. So the way that we're going to do that is we go under the Equipment tab, and then we go to Firmware Management, and we want to see what is in the current catalog. Okay, so if we look at in this particular case, we're running version 3.1, 1 Edward, okay, 1E being the sub-release, like the maintenance release. And then if we open up the individual parts, so let's just click on the plus and continue to open these, you can see that it gets very, very granular as to the different components of the system. So we can see that the UCS manager has a version, the I/O modules have a version, okay, and we can see here these are the Fabric extenders, the 2208s that go inside the chassis. They have a startup version of 3.1, and then they also have a backup version of 2.0. So the previous upgrade path, I had gone from 203A to 311E. And when I made that upgrade, so I changed essentially the backup version to 3.1, then it reboots the I/O module, it moves the backup version to the active version, and then the old active version becomes the new backup. So basically, if there was some sort of like corruption of the image, let's say it goes to run an MD5 hash and then the file is corrupt, it can auto fall back to 2.0. So basically, you can't brick the system, or it's very difficult to brick the system when you're doing an upgrade, because it's going to do this automatically. Okay, then we could see, likewise for the VIC adapter, okay, this VIC 1240 is running 411F. It has a backup version of 2.2C. You can see the individual blade has all the sub version numbers. So it just gets very, very granular, you know, what particular parts are running, what particular versions, and then we can control all of these individually. Okay, but in vast majority of cases, you're not really going to do that. It's only if you run into some sort of issue with software-hardware compatibility matrix, like let's say you upgrade to VMware 6.5, which is their current newest release, and then if you find that some hardware is not supported in the newest firmware, like 3.1, whatever sub-release of the UCS manager, then you could say, for this adapter, I have to roll back the firmware, and you can selectively do that. Okay, but here under firmware management, mainly we're going to be doing the auto install. Okay, so the first thing, like I mentioned, we need to do is to upload the file. Okay, they call it downware or download the firmware, which is a little bit confusing. They're saying this basically from the Fabric interconnect's point of view, that it is downloading the firmware from you. Okay, but I would say it makes a little bit more sense that we're uploading the file to it. But either way, so we go to download firmware, and then we're going to go to the local file system. Okay, and in the case of the rack rentals, these files, you shouldn't really need to change these files, but if you just want to see how the firmware packages work, on the desktop under the, or not under the desktop, there should be a file share. Okay, so lab files under UCS drivers and then UCS firmware. Okay, we have the, in this case, I have the infrastructure bundle, which is 3.1 and then sub-release 3A. So we're going up a couple sub-releases from 1 Edward to 3A. And you can see it's a fairly large file, okay, about 650 megs. So you don't want to be uploading this like over remote access VPN, something like that. Okay, so we're transferring the file, hopefully self-explanatory. It's just uploading it to Flash. So you can also do this from the CLI, of course. Or you could do it from the API calls, but the CLI syntax is not the same as Nexus. So again, when we go to the connect NXOS of the FIs, remember that you cannot make configuration changes from there. So you cannot copy like SFTP flash. You can only run show commands from the NXOS CLI. You can do these changes from the scope syntax, and where you would find that is under the firmware management documentation. Okay, so while we're waiting for this to upload, let's go ahead and take a look at where this is documented. So let's go to Cisco Docs, and then we're going to go to Products, Servers, Unified Computing, then UCS Manager. Okay, so not the hardware documentation, not like the 6200 Fabric interconnects. We want to go down to UCS Manager. And then this is going to be, I want to say that this is going to be the, let's try configuration guides. It may be under the install and upgrade guides. I want to check the config guides first though. And I want to say that this is going to be probably just administration. Okay, so let's say administration management from the GUI and then also from the CLI. The administration management, this would be, now this is going to be the other stuff, which is going to be like enabling Telnet or SSH would be communication services. We want to go under firmware management. There we go. Firmware. There's a separate section, firmware management guide. Okay, so this is firmware management from the GUI, and then firmware management from the CLI. Okay, so basically this is just showing you, how to upload the file and stuff, how to run the auto install. But from the CLI, we could also do the management. Okay, so managing firmware through the UCS Manager, and then download and manage firmware from the UCS Manager. And then in this case, this should be the somewhere in here should be the CLI syntax. Okay, so here specifically, what this is showing here is that when you go to download the files, there's essentially 3 separate packages, and it depends on what individual version that you're running. I think in the newest version, they've condensed this into just one giant bin file that has everything. But in the previous releases, there used to be 3 packages, one for infrastructure, one for B blades, and one for C rack mounts. You would essentially just upload all 3 of the packages to the Fabric interconnects, and then it decides based on the specific blade part number what individual firmware do you need. So it's not like most other server vendors where you kind of have to hunt around for your individual like motherboard revision, the individual BIOS version in order to download it. Luckily in this case it's just one giant file that basically has the entire catalog. Okay, so if we go back to the GUI, hopefully the download is done. Okay, so now if we look under the images, okay, so we're under equipment, firmware management, images, and then we should be able to see here some of the different packages. So if you zoom in a little bit here, we can see like for the I/O module, there's 3 different packages. We have 222C, 311E, and 313A. So we're going to be moving between these 2. Okay, so the file size is talking about the file size on the Fabric Interconnects flash. This is different than the firmware being installed to the actual module. Okay, like the adapter, like I mentioned, has 2 different slots in its flash. It has one for active, one for backup. In this case, we have 3 different versions, so we can't fit all 3 of them onto the part. But these are going to stay in the just the Fabric Interconnect flash until we delete it. Okay, so the storage I believe is fairly large. If we log into the Fabric Interconnect from the CLI, and then let's go to the Connect NXOS, and let's just look at the show version. So this one here is running 2.2. And then let's see, boot flash is, what is that, 32 gigs that would be. So normally you're not going to run out of space for storage for the images. Because as we saw, the infrastructure bundle for the 3.1 was only 650 megs. So basically you can keep a couple versions in there when you're doing the upgrade. And then worst case scenario, if something doesn't work, you can just roll back to whatever your older version was. Okay, so before we go any further, let me go to the console of the one running the 3.1 or 3.1.1, and then we're going to be upgrading this to 3.1.3. Okay, so let's log in as admin. We're going to look at the scope to Fabric Interconnect. Okay, so from the regular CLI, if we just hit a question mark, you don't go to config T here. We go to scope, and then in this particular case, we want to scope to the Fabric Interconnect. Okay, so scope to Fabric Interconnect, which fabric? So let's say Fabric A. And then from here, let's show question mark. We want to show the firmware package version. Okay, so right now we're running 3.1.1e. If we just say show firmware, it says like the different sub-releases. Okay, so the 3.1 really means NXOS version 5.0 sub-release, 3N2, 3.1.1e. And then we can see that the startup system, okay, is the same one. Okay, so it basically means that if we reboot, we're going to be running that particular version. What we should see is that when we do the auto install, there's going to be a difference between the running version and the startup version, and then we have to reboot in order to move it to the new version. Okay, so eventually, once we're done, this should move to 3.1.3, which is the sub-release. Okay, so next, now that we have the firmware uploaded, okay, we can see it there, 3.1.3a. We're going to go to firmware auto install, and it asks us now what package do we want to install. So do we want to install the infrastructure firmware, or do we want to install the server firmware? Okay, in our case, we're going to do the infrastructure first. The reason why is that the FIs need to be running a version that is equal to or greater than or equal to the servers. So what I mean by this is that the servers cannot be running 3.1 while the FI is running 2.2. The FI could be running 3.1 and the blades could be running 2.2, assuming that their hardware is supported, but it doesn't work the reverse way. Okay, so we need to install infrastructure firmware first. Okay, when we do this, it says there's a couple prerequisites. Okay, like make sure that there's not a hardware issue. Okay, check if there's any unsupported hardware. So they're saying this is up to you. Okay, the system's not going to check that for you. Okay, so we're assuming that's fine. It says you don't have NTP configured. Okay, that could result in unnecessary delays. That one we can just ignore. Okay, for production, of course, you would want to sync the time. Critical and major faults exist. Proceeding without fix might lead to system in an unexpected state. So this is basically saying the system doesn't know what the current state of your domain is. Okay, if you have a power problem with the chassis and the chassis is not booting up, then if I go to install the new firmware, it's not going to download it to the I/O modules. In our particular case, since it's not production, we can just ignore this. Okay, but otherwise, you would want to make sure that all those categories are satisfied. Okay, so now once we check this, you can see next install infrastructure firmware is grayed out. So we check ignore all, okay, or assuming you meet those requirements. Then we go to next. Okay, now we're going to install the firmware. Okay, so the infrastructure pack, if we look at the version numbers, we should see that we have 3 different versions in Flash. Okay, so the older 2.2, the 3.1.1e we're moving from, and then 3.1.3a that we're moving towards. Notice this is package A. So again, bundle A is the infrastructure, B is the blades, C is the rack mounts. Okay, so we want to upgrade now. Okay, you generally don't want to click force. Okay, force is saying that, even if it's not supported, then upgrade it. Okay, probably a bad idea. You want it to, figure out what is or is not compatible on its own. Okay, so upgrade now and then finish. Okay, so we'll keep an eye on this. The process is not very quick. It probably takes, maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes or more, because it has to upgrade the FIs, reboot them. Okay, you reboot them one at a time. So you have your standby FI gets the new version and reboots. Then your primary FI gets the new version and reboots. Okay, the secondary one is then taking over. But they're assuming that your service profiles are properly set up to deal with that. Like your VNICs have fabric failover, or your VHBAs have multipath I/O in order to get to the storage network. So if you're trying to do an in-service software upgrade, like a hitless upgrade, then you need to make sure that your service profiles are properly designed in order to allow for that to begin with.